Forget what you've seen in the movies. Forget the heroic charges, the clear-cut, good guys and bad guys. For the American grunt in Vietnam, the real war wasn't just against an enemy in the enemy was the air he breathed, the ground he walked on, and the suffocating silence between firefights. This is the story of why. For the men who fought it, Vietnam was a unique kind of hell. Hollywood in the 1960s sold a simple story, righteous American heroes fighting a definable evil. It was John Wayne, standing tall, assuring the world of our might and our moral clarity. But the jungles of Southeast Asia didn't follow a script. For the average infantryman, grunt reality was a chaotic, terrifying, and bewildering mess that defied any simple explanation. There was no front line, no safe area in the rear. The war was everywhere, all the time. It wasn't just a battle against other soldiers. It was a war on three fronts. A war against a landscape that was actively trying to kill you. A war against an invisible enemy who used that landscape as a weapon. And maybe the toughest war of all, the one against the slow decay of your own mind. This wasn't about glory. It was about making it to the next minute in a place that seemed built to swallow you whole. Before a soldier ever heard a shot fired, he was already in a fight for his life against the environment itself. Vietnam was a sensory overload of misery. The moment you stepped off the plane, the first thing that hit you wasn't a bullet. It was the heat. Not just hot, but a thick, wet, suffocating blanket that clung to you, day and night. The humidity hovered near 100%, so sweat didn't evaporate. It just soaked your fatigues until they were perpetually damp and rotting. This climate alone could drain a man of his will to move, making heat exhaustion and dehydration as constant a threat as any sniper. Then there was the rain. During monsoon season, it wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a biblical flood that turned the earth into a soupy, boot-sucking bog for weeks on end. Staying dry was a complete fantasy. Soldiers lived in a constant state of dampness, which led to a whole host of skin problems. The most infamous was jungle rot, a catch-all term for the fungal infections that thrived in the moisture. Your feet, the most important tool an infantryman has, were in constant danger. Stuck for days in muddy water inside leather boots, they'd get immersion foot, a nasty condition where the skin would swell, crack, and peel away, sometimes taking chunks of flesh with it. It was a constant, painful reminder that the very ground you stood on was hostile. The terrain itself was an enemy. You were either climbing jagged mountains, hacking through Tripocanapi jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, or wading through vast, flooded rice paddies. Just moving was a brutal, exhausting chore. Platoons had to cut their way through the jungle with machetes, a noisy process that basically screamed "ambush me" to any enemy in the area. The soldier in Vietnam was called a grunt for a reason. It was the sound he made when he hefted his pack, and they humped the boonies, carrying anywhere from 60 to over 100 pounds of gear. Your rucksack, your M16, ammo, grenades, claymore mines, radio, water. To Russians it was a crushing weight that ground you down, day after day. One vet said he'd have to sit on the ground, strap on his pack, and then get a buddy to pull him to his feet, because it was just too heavy to stand up with on his own. And the land was alive. It was teeming with critters that seemed to have a special hatred for American soldiers. Leeches dropped from trees and swam through the water, latching onto any bit of exposed skin. Fire ants, scorpions, and giant centipedes made their homes in your boots and gear. And then there were the snakes. Some were so venomous they were called two-step snakes, because after a bite, that's all you had time for. And of course, the mosquito, swarms of them, carrying malaria that could knock a soldier out of the fight as surely as a bullet. Your home in the field was a hole in the ground, a foxhole, maybe with a poncho pulled over it to keep some of the rain out. Sleep was a luxury, always interrupted by your turn on watch. Real hygiene was impossible. You were lucky to wash your hands, let alone shower. The water you drank, often scooped from a stream or from a contaminated army bladder, was a lottery ticket for a nasty case of dysentery. And then there was the food, the infamous syrup. This was the monotonous, canned diet that fueled the grunt. A hot meal might be the universally despised ham and lima beans, or maybe spaghetti and meatballs. It all came in a box with crackers, a canned dessert, and an accessory packet with instant coffee and cigarettes. In the rear, you might get hot food, but in the field, you ate rations cold, day after day. The only way to heat them up was a trick soldiers figured out early on. pinching off a small ball of C4 plastic explosive. It burned hot and fast, just enough to warm a can of beef stew, a tiny comfort in a world of misery. The canned peaches and pound cake were like gold, hoarded and traded among men, desperate for a taste of something good. This whole experience, the heat, the rain, the rot, the weight, the bugs, the filth, the food, was the foundation of life in Vietnam. It was a daily battle of attrition that wore your body down long before the enemy ever fired a shot. If the land was a relentless enemy, the human enemy was a ghost. The war in Vietnam wasn't fought on clear front lines. It was a guerrilla war, a war of shadows. For the American grunt, this meant the battlefield was 360 degrees, and the enemy was invisible right up until the moment he tried to kill you. This created a special kind of psychological terror. Nowhere was safe. A well-defended firebase could be hit with mortars at any time, and any quiet trail could be hiding a gruesome death. That constant, gnawing tension of never knowing when or where an attack would come from took a massive toll. The Viet Cong were masters of their environment, and they weaponized the jungle with ingenious and sadistic booby traps. These weren't always designed to kill. Often, they were made to maim, to wound one soldier and, by doing so, slow down and demoralize his entire squad. They were built from simple, everyday materials, but their effects were devastating. The numbers tell a horrifying story. Booby traps and mines accounted for roughly 11% of all American deaths and 17% of the wounded. The most infamous was the punji stick trap, sharpened bamboo stakes, often smeared with human waste to cause infection, hidden in a camouflaged pit. An unlucky soldier would fall through, impaling his leg or foot. Some were designed so the stakes angled downwards, making it impossible to pull the leg out without tearing the flesh even more. The VC would sometimes dig several pits together, so a buddy rushing to help his friend would fall into a trap himself. Tripwires were everywhere, strung low to the ground and nearly invisible. Snagging one with your boot could unleash any number of horrors. A simple grenade, a toe-popper cartridge that would fire up through your foot, or a bouncing Betty mine that would pop up to waist height before exploding and sending shrapnel everywhere. The bamboo whip trap used the jungle's own tension, bending back a large bamboo pole armed with spikes. When the tripwire was hit, the pole would whip across the trail with enough force to impale a man. Every step was a calculated risk. The most dangerous job in the platoon was walking point, being the first man in line. The point man was the unit's eyes, constantly scanning the ground for a patch of disturbed earth, a nearly invisible wire, any sign of a trap. He was the platoon's first line of defense, and almost always the first casualty. The mental strain of that job is impossible to imagine, a minute-by-minute dance with death. The other half of this invisible war was the ambush. Combat in Vietnam was rarely a long, drawn-out battle. It was a sudden, shocking explosion of violence. One moment, you're on a quiet patrol. The next, the world erupts in automatic weapons fire from an enemy you can't even see. It was pure chaos. The noise was deafening. The jungle was so thick you were firing at muzzle flashes, and the first few seconds were just a desperate scramble for cover, which, itself, could be Often, the Viet Cong would hit hard and then melt back into the jungle, leaving behind dead and wounded Americans and a shattered, disoriented platoon. These short, terrifying encounters were the signature of the war. There was no time for tactics or battle plans. It was pure, reactive survival. This style of fighting drove the American military crazy. We had all the firepower and technology, but how do you bomb an enemy you can't find? How do you fight an army that doesn't wear a uniform and can vanish into a village or a tunnel in seconds? For the soldier on the ground, the result was a feeling of permanent vulnerability. A feeling that no matter how powerful your army was, you, as an individual, were always being hunted. You were always just one wrong step away from disaster. The physical hell of Vietnam was brutal, and the terror of combat was constant, but the most lasting damage was often done to a soldier's mind. The very nature of the war created a special kind of hell for the psyche, a war within, that would follow veterans for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the most corrosive part was the moral confusion. In past wars, the enemy was clear. They wore a different uniform and belonged to a nation. The line between soldier and civilian was generally understood. In Vietnam, that line practically didn't exist. The Viet Cong fighter who tried to kill you at night could be the same farmer who smiled at you in the village that morning. Women and even children were used to plant traps or act as combatants, This created a crippling paranoia. These were kids, most of them 18 or 19 years old, thrown into a world where they couldn't trust anyone. Every civilian was a potential threat, every village a potential hornet's nest. This confusion was made worse by the military's own goals. On one hand, soldiers were told to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. On the other, they were operating in a war of attrition where the main measure of success was the body count. The pressure from up top to report high numbers of enemy killed was constant, and it created a dehumanizing environment. In the heat and chaos of a firefight, that pressure could lead to tragic mistakes, where innocent civilians got caught in the crossfire. Horrors like the My Lai massacre were the most extreme examples, but the underlying dynamic was felt by soldiers everywhere. They were asked to be saviors and killers at the same time, a psychologically impossible position for anyone. Seeing friends die inflicted its own deep wounds. It wasn't a sanitized event. It was violent, gruesome, and personal. Soldiers watched their buddies get torn apart by explosions and cut down by gunfire. To survive that kind of trauma, many had to shut down emotionally. They developed what came to be known as the 1,000-yard stare, a vacant, unfocused gaze that showed a mind detaching itself from the horror. It was a necessary defense mechanism in the field, but it came at a price, creating an emotional void that would be incredibly difficult to fill later in life. All of this was compounded by a creeping sense of futility. Unlike World War II, there was no clear objective in Vietnam. Soldiers would fight and die to take a hill, only for it to be abandoned a few days later. They'd clear an area of VC, only for the enemy to move right back in after they left. To the grunts on the ground, the grand political theories about dominoes and containment were meaningless. They weren't fighting for democracy. They were fighting to keep themselves and the man next to them alive. This forged an unbreakable brotherhood, but also a sense that their sacrifices were being wasted on a war with no purpose and no end in sight. By the later years of the war, discipline in some units started to break down. Drug use became a common escape from the pressure. Even more terrifying was the rise of fragging, where enlisted men would use fragmentation grenades to attack their own officers, usually in retaliation for being ordered into what they saw as a pointless or suicidal fight. It was a sign of a deep sickness, a sign that the psychological strain was causing the very fabric of the military to unravel. Ultimately, the war in Vietnam forced young men to see the absolute worst of humanity and to confront the darkness in themselves. It tore away their moral certainties, leaving behind doubt, guilt, and fear. It was a war where victory was a fuzzy concept. The enemy looked just like the people you were supposed to be helping. And survival often meant shutting down the very empathy that makes us human. The physical wounds might heal, but these psychological scars would last a lifetime. For every soldier in Vietnam, there was one single dream: getting back to the world. That's what they called the United States, a place that felt like another universe compared to the mud, blood, and fear. The last few weeks of a soldier's 365-day tour were filled with a special anxiety, short-timers fever, the terrifying thought of being killed right before you were supposed to go home. The dream of stepping off that plane into the arms of family and a grateful nation was what kept so many of them going. For most Vietnam veterans, that dream shattered the moment they landed. Unlike the heroes of World War II who returned in fleets to cheering crowds and ticker-tape parades, Vietnam vets came home one by one. The military's replacement system sent you over as an individual, and it sent you back the same way. One day you could be in a firefight in the jungle, and just a couple of days later you were standing on a street corner in your hometown, utterly alone. There was no group decompression, no unit to share stories with, just a jarring, whiplash-inducing transition from the hell of war to the quiet world of home. But the loneliness was nothing compared to the welcome. The America they came back to was a country torn in half by the very war they had just fought. The anti-war movement had grown powerful, and a lot of that anger was aimed directly at the soldiers. Instead of parades, many vets were met with protests and insults. They were called baby killers. One veteran remembers someone at an airport throwing a lit cigarette at him. Others were told not to wear their uniforms in public to avoid a confrontation. For a soldier who had just risked his life, this rejection was a deep and bitter betrayal. Even those who didn't face open hostility were met with an awkward silence. People didn't know what to say. Most people just wanted to forget the war ever happened. This left the veteran feeling isolated, misunderstood, and alienated from his own country. And then there were the invisible wounds. Back then, we didn't even have a name for what these men were going through. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, wouldn't be officially recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, long after the war was over. The symptoms we now know of the flashbacks, the nightmares, the constant state of high alert, the depression, the rage were often just dismissed as combat fatigue or a sign of personal weakness. Vets were told to just get over it. The VA was completely unequipped to handle these psychological injuries. Studies would later reveal the devastating scale of the problem. Depending on the study, it's estimated that somewhere between 15% and 30% of Vietnam vets suffered from PTSD in their lifetimes. The war didn't end when they came home. It just followed them, raging inside their heads for years to come. There were also the physical scars that took years to appear. The military had sprayed millions of gallons of chemical herbicides, most famously Agent Orange, to kill the jungle foliage. In the process, they exposed hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers to toxic chemicals. Over the decades, that exposure has been linked to a host of horrible health problems, including cancers, heart disease, diabetes, and Parkinson's illnesses that have affected not only the veterans but their children as well. For so many, the homecoming was the final, cruelest battle of their war. They survived the jungle, the traps, and the ambushes, only to come back to a country that seemed to either hate them or want to forget them. They were left to deal with their physical wounds, their psychological trauma, and their feelings of alienation almost entirely on their own. The society they fought for didn't understand their sacrifice, and the government that sent them was painfully slow to acknowledge the damage. For a whole generation of warriors, coming home didn't mean the war was over. The story of the American soldier in Vietnam isn't a simple tale of heroes and villains. It's a story of human endurance. It's about ordinary young men who were thrown into an extraordinarily terrible situation, forced to fight a war on multiple fronts at once. They fought a visible enemy in a jungle that was itself an near place of suffocating heat, endless rain, and constant rot. They fought an invisible enemy who turned every trail and rice paddy into a potential death trap. But the hardest battle was the one they fought inside themselves. It was a war against moral confusion, where friend and foe were almost impossible to tell apart. It was a fight against the slow erosion of the soul that comes from witnessing unimaginable trauma, and the gnawing feeling that their sacrifice was for a cause that was unclear and maybe even They survived all that, only to face one last battle when they returned. A battle against a society that rejected them, a government that ignored them, and the invisible wounds that would scar them for the rest of their lives. When you strip away all the myths and the politics, you're left with the grunt in the jungle, a young man soaked to the bone, carrying 100 pounds of gear and the even heavier weight of fear and doubt, fighting just to protect the guy next to him and live to see the next sunrise. His experience wasn't about glory, it was about survival in a place uniquely designed to break the body, the mind, and the spirit. To understand why it sucked to be a soldier in Vietnam isn't about judging the war. It's about honoring the profound and painful reality of what those men went through. It's about remembering their sacrifice, not as characters in a movie, but as human beings who were pushed to the absolute limit and whose war, for many, never really ended. The experiences of these veterans are a critical part of our nation's story, and to truly honor them, we have to understand what they went through. If you have a story or a reflection to share, please leave it in the comments below. Keeping this conversation alive is how we make sure their sacrifices are never forgotten. If you believe understanding our history is the key to building a better future, please consider subscribing. Thanks for listening.